Yes, Guyana to the world.
Globuspan is a Guyanese dialogue moving towards the realization of one nation in one Guyana. It's a platform that offers an all-inclusive discussion with the pros, the cons, the ones that is taken aside, and the ones that stand in the middle. Globuspan believes agreeing and disagreeing are part of the nation's building.
She is a beauty, beautiful Guyana, with wonderful people all over this country.
Globuspan believes every Guyanese voice is part of the nation's building. As we span the globe for voices from the diaspora and those living home, we stand on our commitment that we are all Guyanese working towards one nation in one Guyana. As the world turns on its axis bringing changes, we as Guyanese must adapt to those changes for a better Guyana for all. Globuspan stands on its axis with its belief that one nation, one Guyana, one destiny must include voices from all corners of Guyana.
With many flavor, 6 different people blended together. Raise your flag high in unity, we're family with one destiny. Raise your flag high in unity.
So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Globuspan 24/7, owned and operated by Mr. Nohar Singh, with Devin Dissoon as our technical operator tonight. As usual, we have a very informed discussion. Tonight, we are discussing the plurality of the Guyanese society and its implication for governance. Joining us for this discussion tonight are 2 esteemed professors, Professor David Hines, Professor Beta Ram Ramarak, Mr. Ravindra Dev, and Mr. Vincent Alexander. None of them is a stranger to this program, and they are well known in Guyanese society. No need to give them any further introduction. So, gentlemen, let's delve right into the subject tonight, the plurality of the Guyanese society. So let's ask one of the professors if he may give us an understanding, a definition of the plurality of the Guyanese society, pluralism. This subject has been treated extensively by sociologists and anthropologists, and even by political scientists. So let's begin with Professor David Hines. Tell us about pluralism, plurality of the Guyanese society.
Thank you very much. Well, as you've said, sociologists and political scientists have delved into this whole notion of pluralism. In our Caribbean, M.G. Smith work is worth referencing in this regard. He was not necessarily speaking about Guyana, he was speaking about the English-speaking Caribbean for the most part, but his work is relevant to an understanding of Guyana. Later, other theorists have delved into the pluralism in the context of ethnically divided society. Our plural history and plural being has to be located in the context of conquest, conquest by the Europeans, and that conquest, of course, led to the coming to Guyana of various groups, some coming against their will, some coming partly against their will, but all of them coming from some other place. Of course, the native Indians, our indigenous people were there before, but they themselves were moving from place to place. And so in many regards, a lot of the tribes, or indigenous tribes, moved to Guyana. So we are, as a plural society, our pluralism is located in that history of conquest and settlement. And the fact that the various groups came at different time, in different circumstances, then makes it very difficult to turn that pluralism into a kind of national idea, into a national practice, into a cohesive nationhood. And as we grapple with the fact of nationhood, as we grapple with the fact of what Ravidev calls a national narrative. One has to begin the conversation in the deep-seated pluralism that exists in our society. Of course, when you do national building, as we have been asked to do after independence in 1966, is that you tend to gloss over the divisions in the society in order to emphasize the oneness. And of course, the risk is also when you emphasize the divisions, you risk recognizing where that pluralism can be molded into oneness. So Guyana, because of its deep-seated pluralism, makes it a very problematic society that is not given to easy solutions. I think, as I said, nation building is something that is like an instant, like a hamburger, and you want to get it over with. And we in Guyana have learned the hard way that a pluralist society that is grounded in the kind of history that we have, there's no quick fix with it.
So, Professor Ramarak, would like to add anything, any contradictions to Dr. Hines on the pluralist society?
Well, David gave a pretty good synopsis of what the term really means and how it originated. But as we always try to do with these kinds of shows, and I know some people out there have been asking, why do we continue to have this discussion? As a side note, we do because, the issues we decide to discuss, especially dealing with race and so on, is obviously very topical and pertinent to where we are in Guyana. So this is the reason why we're here. But I just want to add to what David is saying in terms of breaking it down, to what that means for us, so we can have that discussion about Guyana. So there are two words that are used in this, title today, which is the whole notion of pluralism. So for us, when we think of pluralism, it's probably easy or it's probably better when you compare Guyana to other societies. There are some societies that didn't necessarily go through the same, experience where you have different groups being introduced to Guyana, as David has said. When you think of places like maybe Denmark or Japan, or China, or closer to home, Dominica, Grenada, and so on, or North Korea, South Korea, these are societies that don't have the kind of different, people who come from different ethnic background and so on that make up these societies. So the challenge is when you have a plural society is how do you establish, a system that really takes the interests, right, and consideration of every group that make up this plural society, which we call Guyana. So the other word that's in our topic here, governance, to me, governance really raises that question. How do you, in a society that has different ethnic groups, right, with different interests, different historical experience, come up with that national narrative that would be, something that we all aspire to. But more importantly, governance also implies that you're trying to create within this plural society a government, which can establish or promote some kind of stable democracy, right? And I think secondly, that also implies that we're trying to create a society, this plural society, that reflects some kind of equitable distribution of the resources we have so that, we can all move along, whether it's aspiring to be this one Guyana, but moving along, as groups, so we don't fall back and question the state, right? So that we can have divisions within the state. That's not good for us, especially at a time when we've discovered, we've got this resource in oil. Society has to kind of progress so that everybody feels part of it, so we can all progress and move up the ladder, so to speak. So that's where I think that concept of pluralism and its application to governance comes in.
So Vincent, Dr. Rammer begin to expand on cultural pluralism and its implications. So before we deal with the implications, Would you like to add anything else to plurality? Because Professor Bertie Ramcharan and the Antiguan ambassador to the U.S. and OAS, Sanders, define Guyana society as a society of at least 6 different nations. We are not one society. Of course, we're not one Guyana, but Guyanas. Would you care to add to the concept of plurality?
Yes, in some regards, to reiterate and emphasize points already made. Firstly, we are in a situation where we have plurality that is natural. It is natural insofar as we have in one place people from different origins, with different cultures, different values, etc. And so the pluralism in that regard could be considered to be natural. But at the same time, we may argue the pluralism is engineered. Engineered insofar as the colonizers consciously brought these different groups into one place. And so although it is natural for us to be a plural society once we all in one place, it's engineered insofar as it wasn't a case where we happened to be, but we were made to be in one place. And in that regard, it is engineered. And so one has to ask the question as we discuss, what are the implications of natural pluralism on one hand and engineered pluralism on the other hand, which is applicable to Guyana, one may consider to be a hybrid in that regard. And once one starts to ask those questions, then the question of governance will apply. What are the implications arising from this pluralism in its natural state, and or the pluralism as engineered in terms of governance, which is essentially a process of decision-making, a process that seeks to put in place public policy, public programs and projects for the administration of the state. What are the implications for that process of governance, decision-making that impacts the society at large, given the natural and or engineered pluralism which we're talking about? And may I indicate that when one talks about a plural society, one does not necessarily speak about ethnic plurality. There could be other forms of plurality. But here in Guyana, I think we have to underline the fact that our plurality is essentially ethnic plurality.
Ravidev?
Well, we've heard a lot on the 2 words that were picked out by Betoram. And I would just like to add that it is not fortuitous that this topic was picked, I understand, by Vincent, for us to discuss today, that the plurality of our society and its governance, they are inextricably linked. And that is why today, after the topic was announced on GlobeSpan, one contributor to the GlobeSpan chat, whatever they had, said these 5 old men are goateing dal. Goateing dal, you swizzle the dal that it becomes uniform. But he meant it in the way that we're going over the same thing. That's the colloquial expression. But ironically, he was making the identification that until you goatee, until you break up these terms, and for us, the Guyanese people, to understand, not at the level of just talking about it, but inculcating the meaning for us, we're not going to go anywhere in Guyana. So if I returned 32 years ago in Guyana, I've done nothing else but think and put out some ideas on this subject for that same reason that I believe that until we grapple with it, we're not going anywhere. We can have money coming out of our kazoos and nothing is going to change. And why is this so? Why is this so? And to come back to Vincent's differentiation between different forms of plurality, engineered and otherwise, I've always looked at our plurality in consonance with Africa. Their pluralism was constituted by Europeans sitting down in Berlin and drawing lines on a map in Africa. And within those lines, they became countries, and they were supposed to be societies. But you had different tribes with different cultural values, different histories, and their pluralism has been as extensive as those that we find elsewhere, including the Guyana. Some people like to downplay it and dismiss it, the term tribalism. There's nothing wrong with tribalism. It's just that is how their society evolved along tribal lines, and that is how they organize their governance and all that. So to return from where I started, in Guyana here, from the very word go, when the Dutch brought enslaved Africans to found this country that we now call Guyana, whether it be in Berbice or in Esquibo or in Demerara, it doesn't matter. They were one set of an ethnic group. They were all white, they were all European, and they were ruling and governing. They call it governing, but I would say they're enslaved. So, but for lack of a better word, let's call it governing the society. So those two terms, they created pluralism from the very beginning. And I don't want to go off on a tangent, but it's not really a tangent because their creation of pluralism here and in Africa was so special from what had preceded history for thousands and thousands of years is what remains with us. Whereas they started the definition of pluralism by taking African people and defining them outside of the human race. By defining them outside of the human race so they can enslave them, and created narratives such as the story of Ham and what have you. Whereas, so we have to start with this foundational point in Guyana here. A, that pluralism was created, whether by drawing lines on a map or by bringing us together here. But it started with one group of humans defining out another group of humans outside of the pale of humanity. And then when the rest of us were brought in, whether here or in South Africa or wherever, we were placed along what Cornel West calls, this band of creation, ranging from God, who was white and with a white beard, coming down all the way to the other races, where the African race was at the bottom. So in Guyana, as we grapple with our plurality of the society and with governance, we can't ignore how it all started, because it is here with us every single day, and some of us would like to pretend. So to those who say we are going over the same thing, it means that the implications of the plurality and its implications for governance in Guyana, they are evading it.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for helping us to understand this concept of plurality and cultural pluralism. Professor Hines, would you like to discuss further on that, or would you like to go into the implications for governance?
Yeah, I would like to introduce the whole concept of governance and try to look at it within the context of our pluralism. And governance, by its very logic, implies power. And power, of course, implies the ability to get people to do things that they would not normally do. And the Western notion of power is grounded in that philosophical outlook. We in Guyana are therefore grappling with the very logic of our pluralism, colliding with the logic of governance. And it makes it extremely difficult then to govern Guyana. Guyana is, for all intents and purposes, an ungovernable place because we are pitting a pluralism, deep-seated pluralism, within a governance system that implies a linear order. The governance system that we have been socialized with in Guyana does not have any place for pluralism. And so therefore, we are then forced to smother or ignore or try to wipe out pluralism. But since pluralism is, Vincent says, is a natural outgrowth of our own history, you're not going to wipe it out. So what we end up doing is we end up reaching for assimilation or domination. And so when we talk about governance in our plural environment in Guyana, we come into contact with the notion of domination coupled with the notion of assimilation, because ultimately we want to solve the problem. The problem of pluralism has to be solved if you are going to accommodate the Western notion of governance and power. So my friend Ravi, for example, has solved that problem. He says, let's look for crossover votes, solve it. And Ravi, of course, will tell me he's not original in that, because what the theorist's name is escaping, that wrote the big book on
Horowitz.
Horowitz is the master at that, right? So, we have to solve this problem of pluralism and get on with the game, right? And the more we try to solve the problem, the more the problem becomes entrenched. One of the errors, understandable errors, that was made at the time of independence, not only in Guyana, but even in the more homogeneous countries in our region, is that we wanted to solve that problem and we wanted to impose on the society a new nationalism, a new Caribbean man, a new Guyanese man, right? And that means that we have to go against nature. We have to go against this natural pluralism in order to bring the nation together. And the shelf life of that is limited. And every twist and turn, we come back to reality. And again, now, as we move into the regime of oil, the regime of the petrol state, we are called upon to solve the problem of pluralism. Let us have one narrative, says my brother Ravi. Let's have a national narrative, right? Meaning you will have to impose that national narrative, because a national narrative in a plural society has to be a coming together of the various narratives. And out of the various narratives, look to see where there is intersection. It is at the intersection of the various narratives that you will find a common narrative. But my brother Ravi doesn't want to go there. That's too long. We have been doing that too long. Let's solve it quickly and get it out of the way, rather than go the hard way of having the various narratives and look at the intersection of the narratives, whether that intersection is on the cricket field, whether that intersection is in the dance hall. We are not prepared to look to see how the narrative evolves. We want to impose a narrative, and that is a dead failure in a society that is as plural and deep-seated plural as we are.
Okay, Dr. Amarak, conflict over domination and assimilation.
Well, see, my biggest problem with what is being discussed here is when we talk about narrative. I mean, here we are, four people talking about narrative. We have the Amerindian, the indigenous population, which can play a power broker, not even part of this discussion that we're having, but it's an important element of what's going to happen next year. You know, we talk about 2020 being the mother of all election. 2025 might be shaping up to be the father of all election. But I want to come back to this question of narrative. And I had written something in Stabrick News in response to Tacoma, where my question really was, where exactly is this, you know, narrative we're talking about, especially when it comes from the Indian perspective, right? And I want to give a little background here uh, as to what this whole notion of narrative reflects today in Guyana society. My basic point was simple. Where exactly is the Indian narrative? And I can extend that to ask the question, you know, where is the indigenous narrative? Is there someone who speaks for that community who can put that narrative on the table so we can move on and have that national narrative? It's not a new question, right? The one Guyana notion was there, you know, before independence, because these cultural groups were seen or considered to be, in a sense, not Guyanese enough because they're focusing on parochial concerns, not national concerns. So one Guyana is not really new, right? But again, I come back to the question of this whole Indian narrative, and I want to pose this question, to David and Alexander. Because my conception of an Indian narrative is it doesn't really exist. There's just a handful of people who talk about it. And I don't think that there's a mistake in allocating an Indian narrative to the current government, the PPP government. The PPP, I've said this before, and I know people raise their eyebrows. The PPP is the vehicle for Indians, but the PPP does not present an Indian narrative. If anything, the PPP government has destroyed the voices of people who would have represent that Indian narrative and organizations. You know, we can talk about, Jang Bahadur Singh, Ganraj Kumar, Balram Singh Rai, and so on. There is really no Indian organization, legitimate Indian organization in Guyana today that speaks to an Indian narrative. And I challenge anyone, to challenge me on that. So what we have here is a narrative, in a sense, that dominate the national space, which is that the narrative we're seeing coming out from people like David Hines and Vincent and Eric Phillips and so on. We don't have that now. So how do we get from this point here to that point, right? And here's the other dilemma that I see here for when we don't talk about the narrative is that we have already written off the whole notion of people who would have an alternative narrative than the one that's being presented by people like David on his show, because it seems like you've written them off, not just in conversation, but also in theory and also in practice. We can talk about 2015 and talk about 2020, right? We say there is no notion of this crossover vote, right? To, in a sense, create or help to push that narrative together and create some semblance of a sort of a national narrative. If we're going to write off what was told to us in 2015, that there is 11%, to borrow the phrase from Moses Nagamutu, 11% of the people crossed over and voted in 2015. That's why they won. And we're now saying, well, okay, well, that's not important. Then in a sense, you're seeking to deny that Indian narrative that would have contributed to the creation of that national narrative. And here we have a situation also where that Indian narrative, if it does exist, and if it existed in 2015, for instance, that Indian narrative has been squelched. Because here you have a guy like Kemraj Ramjatan, Moses Nagamutu, who could have speak to that 11%, right? and allow that narrative to proliferate in that coalition government. But what do we see happening? Uh, those people, the rug was pulled from under their feet, and their voices were squelched. So again, I come back to this whole question of where exactly is that Indian narrative? I don't see it in the current government, which is the mistake that people tend to make, that that this PPP government speaks to an Indian. It does not, right? And I stand by what I said about that, and I can give you a lot of examples. You've talked about some of them already. So where is that Indian narrative? That's the first question. And secondly, my observation is that because we don't have that Indian narrative, it means that one narrative dominates the national space. And it comes back to this whole question of, whose narrative is more legitimate. And it raised an important question about governance. Whose narrative will dominate, let's say, if the opposition gets in? If that Indian narrative a priori does not even exist.
Vincent, he posed a question to you. There is an African narrative. There is no indigenous narrative, no Indian narrative. So what discussions can take place if there is only an African narrative?
The first point I want to make is that I don't think there's national acceptance of the problem.
Of
the problem.
Oh.
I don't think as a nation we have articulated this problem which we're confronted with. And in fact, when attempts are made to articulate the problem, there are those, and I think Ravi in a sense referred to that earlier, who tend to say that this problem does not exist. And so I think the first issues we're faced with is an acceptance and articulation of the problem. In that regard, I think that our intelligentsia, be they African or Indian or Amerindian or any Guyanese, would have failed us. Because I don't think our intelligentsia, people in sociology, etc., have paid sufficient attention, if at all, to this question. You have very, very few people among our intelligentsia who've addressed this. In terms of writings, I can only think of, what's her name? Who was a sociologist at the University of Guyana who did some writing on this matter. I can't remember her name right now. She's married to an economist, who we all know as well. So that's my first issue. Acceptance and articulation of the problem. That is very essential. The next point I want to make is that when we deal with this question of the plurality, we cannot ignore the question of our politics and our economics, because they're the two foundational elements in terms of the existence of our society. And I would argue that built onto our natural pluralism is the politics, and that in terms of the political life of our country, the politics has, in some regards, sought to be a beneficiary, or the politicians have sought to be a beneficiary of that pluralism, and therein do not, in fact, help in the articulation of the issue of pluralism. So we have a problem there. The other problem we have is that our pluralism has taken on economic connotations as well. And that is part of the engineering which has occurred, starting with the manner in which the plantation owners dealt with the different ethnic groups. So that when we talk about our pluralism, we have to use the broader understanding of the concept of culture, because our pluralism has become evident in our politics and evident in our economics. and both of which we may argue have been engineered. And so the question is, had we not engineered the political and economic pluralism along ethnic lines, where would we have been as a society? And whether, in fact, a resolution to the political and economic engineering puts us in a position where we can deal with the natural pluralism and in that regard seek to build a society that is harmonious. But if we don't deal with that, or if we accept the political engineering and economic engineering, then what model of governance are we going to put in place built upon that acceptance that still provides an opportunity for a harmonious society? So I don't particularly agree with Betaram's contention that there is no Indian narrative in Guyana. In fact, I think if we were to check the literature, not necessarily non-fiction, the fiction literature of Guyana, we will see, in my view, Indo-Guyanese articulating on this matter far more than any Afro-Guyanese has articulated. Whether the narrative is popular narrative is another question, but certainly at the level of the intelligentsia, I think the Indian narrative has been more articulated, which is different from organizations that have in a sense come up. And I would argue that the Indo-Guyanese community is more monolithic than the African Guyanese community. And in that monolithic existence, one can see the disposition of the Indo-Guyanese at the discretion of the plural society, as opposed to the African community that is less monolithic, a more hegemonic society, more plural society, where not having that one grounded in that one base, different factions have come along to say different things on this question. And when I talk about the hegemony, the hegemonic situation, I would argue that the existence of one dominant religion in the Hindu religion lends to an Indian expression on this question, as opposed to the African community where there's no one religion. And very often religion is not just religion, it's associated with beliefs and with philosophy. It's associated with the world outlook. And so there's that divergence as far as I'm concerned on this question. But that divergence does not interfere with the fact that there is the need for the question to be addressed, because if the question is not addressed, then we will not have the kind of harmony and cohesion that can lend to national development. And in that regard, I wish to say that this whole question has to be addressed at various levels.
But Vincent, you said there are elements of an Indian narrative, but you're not giving me some specific elements of what that narrative represents.
I'm arguing that the very existence of the Hindu religion and the fact that the Hindu community the Indian community at large are led by, embraced in, that represents a disposition of the Indian Guyanese to the Guyanese society. But I've also said that when one looks at literature, the fictional literature, one can see much more expressions in relation to the Indian thought on this matter than one can see when one looks at the African literature. But I may also say that given the nature of the Indian community, within that community of itself, there's a lesser need for the articulation. And I may say to you that yes, there is a need for the articulation in terms of the interrelationship across the ethnic divide. But the African community, that articulation has to do with the way in which the African community has evolved and have issues of identity. I don't think the Indian community is evolving in a similar manner with those issues of identity. And so in some regards, where they're at is taken for granted. But where the African community is not taken for granted because there's serious issues of identity. And it's around those issues of identity that we have the articulation coming from the African Guyanese community.
Rafi, the fictional writers, Indian fictional writers, surely they talked about some aspects of a narrative, but not. I don't recall ever reading about a political narrative, a government narrative, a power equation, powers in general. I think they usually speak of cultural relations. I mean, correct me if you can.
If I could just say one word before Ravi speaks.
Please.
I think what they say is more implied, and that's the nature of literature, than explicit.
Okay, Ravi, you want to add to it? There is an Indian narrative that is not expressly stated in politics and by the intelligentsia, the elite, the government.
You see, there's a lot of irony in this discussion here, and we're going off in various tangents, and we really got to stick to one of the lines and eke out some kind of agreement. So when let me start with something that David said, and this is where I think David has misunderstood what we've been saying about the whole nature of narratives. It is something that we didn't invent. Some scholars in Europe, in the post-communist era, they've talked about the various kinds of narratives that have come out to deal with their era. And so we adopted some of their terminology. And one of that terminology, we talked about memory warriors, that their narrative that they construct only sees their group's experience as describing the totality of the nation. When we speak of memory warriors, it's not just somebody who uses historical incidents or historical antecedents. It's their premise that there's only one narrative and their narrative is it, and they have the legitimacy to speak for the whole nation. They are called the memory warriors. They are memory pluralists. Those who see that there are different narratives in plural societies. So the memory pluralists, they accept that there are different narratives, and those narratives must be taken into account by the various groups if they are to create a national narrative. David, and I agree, there may be nodes at which they intersect, where you can see that, and hence, in my exposition in the beginning, when I spoke about the enslavement of African peoples as the foundational act of modern pluralism, which gives a whole new, and I'll use a pun, color to all pluralisms, whether we like it or not. We cannot avoid that. But what I was doing there is to give recognition to African Guyanese and their narrative, that Indo-Guyanese within their narrative, must deal with for us to have a national narrative. You get me? We can't ignore that what had happened to the African people when they were enslaved and brought over here. And I don't see that nuance, especially of recent, with David and in what direction he has gone, as compared to the early WPA of Walter Rodney and others, which was much more in terms of a memory pluralist, right? So that's one point I want to make, that we should at least understand the terms we are using. And in that sense, when we speak, we're speaking about the same thing and not conflicting other things. So to come back to Vincent's point about there being an implicit narrative in any in the Indian community, human beings need narratives to make sense of the world. So there's always narratives, right? What's a narrative? Something happened. I have to explain why it happened. And in my own mind, I then say, well, this is maybe why that thing happened. And it's part, and many times what we use to explain that thing that just happened is part of our people's historical memory. So inevitably, we come to addressing any situation out of our own experiences, and it's part of a narrative. But you see, Vincent, the point is that unless that narrative is overtly articulated, where the individuals who then are set to form that group accept that narrative, you understand? Then you don't have people representing the sentiments of that narrative. For example, I've spoken many times about this. Rupert and I spent countless hours. Because when I returned to Guyana, I spent half my time up at the WPA headquarters, and Rupert and I spent a lot of hours on this whole notion of, not overtly at that time, we hadn't made what is called a narrative turn to talk about narratives per se, but we talked about being Indian and all that. And Rupert was very honest, for example, in his own experience, to say, boy, Ravi, I am more at home or comfortable with in Mackenzie rather than Mahaika, where he was living at that time. And similarly, what's his name? Moses Bhagwan, who I spent a lot of time at his office up at Mirage Building and where I view. And he also confessed that as the son of a Christian catechist, right? When he looked at the Indian problematic, he looked at it purely from a political standpoint as them being excluded from the political relations by Mr. Burnham and the PNC. That was his perspective. But in terms of it being part of an Indian narrative, that was not his thing. That was not his thing. So the point I want to reiterate that what the point that Beto is making is that until people from the Indian community can accept an articulation of an Indian narrative, it doesn't have to be monolithic. There'll be Indians all across the board. So in that sense, then Rupert would be maybe at one end of a spectrum, of an Indian spectrum. But there's always a modal point as to what it's all about. So that's the second thing. The last thing I want to conclude with, and this, I thought I'll get this opportunity to speak directly to David. And because I've noticed in the last few months, he has become much more, I would use the word advisedly, strident in his articulation of the African dilemma as he sees it. Much stronger, using very strong words. And my fear is that, and this is proven in all plural societies, that the manner in which you articulate your concerns, it has repercussions inevitably with the individuals who form that group. Inevitably so, because like I said, people make assumptions as to when things happen as to what is, what's happening. So if, for example, we only play the blame game and we don't point out commonalities, or we don't reach across the divide and talk about the pain of the other, then we are doing a disservice to ever creating a situation where we may have that national narrative and we may go together, as one country. And that is my fear. And I will conclude by this. And this was the point I wanted to ask David personally. Way back as a young man, I read Sir Arthur Lewis's Politics in West Africa. And apart from pointing out that plural societies should be looking at coalitions and federalism, and that was one of our entree into federalism, to handle the situation as governance structure, he had an interesting ending that passage very interestingly when he talked about how we must go forward on dealing with plural societies. He asked this, he says, on counting heads, and he was talking of that mode of procedural democracy, on the counting of heads, should the Africans of Guyana be liquidated? And it was a very strong word that stayed with me. And Arthur Lewis was no, bully pulpit guy jumping on some soapbox trying to score easy points. He was an Oxford grad who tried to save the Caribbean Federation, argued with Eric Williams and all that, future Nobel Prize winner and what have you. The point is, here's a man, but yet he used a very strong term. And hence, I want to link it up with where I started, that I believe that in African intellectuals, looking at the African predicament, not only here, worldwide, and Vincent as a member of EPADG should appreciate this, they're facing certain conditions that make the situation very dire. And Arthur Lewis also knew of that situation. He was part of the 1945 Pan-African Congress in Manchester. So he knew of all of this that been talked about. He was an integral part of that. So I want to ask David, is that I think we need to have a very frontal discussion as to how the African see what does his narrative, in his narrative, how does he see the world? Because I feel it is qualitatively different from others. I start back with Arthur Lewis's strong word, because in Guyana I don't see that. I don't see it as a matter of extermination, then nor now. But in listening to you of recent, I have a sense that somewhere there you're grappling with this. Talk to me.
David, talk
Well,
to him.
of course, one has to constantly grapple with that question. And I think, Ravi, you answered the question coming out of the history that Africans have come out of. We have to constantly grapple with the existence and threat of liquidation. Slavery was meant to liquidate us. And we are still dealing with the scars of slavery, the scars of bondage. And so the threat of liquidation is constant in the African narrative.
It's live. Is it a live thing, or is it something just to rouse up there, David? That's
No. It comes out of the experience, and at different historical juncture, one feels it. Robin Dobrus, I can feel it in my bones. I can feel it in the sun. One feels it, and one's articulation of the narrative becomes, I'll use your term, more strident than not. Walter Rodney himself said, one emphasizes, and Ravi, you are au fait with that, with that piece by Rodney, that one talks about one's identity today so that one doesn't have to talk about it tomorrow. All right? And so you are correct. There are moments when the threat of dispossession, the threat of dishonor, the threat of disenfranchisement becomes larger. And so the response to that has to be equal. No. I'm glad, Ravi, that you clarify, because I was worried about what Beat Ram is saying. that there's a difference between the narrative and the articulation of the narrative. The narrative is always there. There's the Indian narrative of suffering, which is under the Burnham years, that Burnham sought to liquidate Indians. He messed with their holy food. He denied them political. That is a strong narrative of suffering. The Amerindians have their narratives of suffering with the conflict with the Europeans. The Africans have their narratives of suffering grounded in slavery. All of us have our narratives of suffering. So when I hear Betaram say, there's no Indian narrative, what is he talking about? There is that strong Indian narrative of suffering. Burnham is demonized in that narrative. Okay? So don't tell me there's no Indian narrative. As Vincent said, in some instances, the Indian narrative is much more pronounced and grounded than the African or the Amerindian narrative. And so there is an Indian narrative. Now, we are talking about articulation of narrative. You will see a louder articulation of Indian narrative, of the Indian narrative, when Indians feel a threat of dispossession, a threat of dishonor. If this government changes tomorrow, that Indian narrative of suffering, that Indian narrative of the possibility of liquidation rises. And the African narrative, because an African government is in power, ours. We have to put this thing in context. Now, the PPP doesn't articulate an Indian narrative. Political parties are not about articulating narratives. Political parties take advantage of narratives. They use it so they think. The PNC doesn't articulate an African narrative. The winner-take-all system precludes political parties from articulating narratives. All right? So, now, does that mean that Dr. Jagan did not articulate an Indian narrative? Go read Forbidden Freedom. He talks about the Indian as being oppressed. Read his Western Trial. He talks about the Indian narrative of suffering. He goes to Gopio and he says Indians are second-class citizens in Guyana. He kept the PPP out of the Federation based on an Indian narrative. It is unfair to that man to say that he did not articulate an Indian narrative. I am of the firm opinion, I'm going to say it here for the first time, Dr. Jagan articulated an Indian Marxism. There's a way in which he blended his Marxism and located it within an Indian reality. Dr. Jagan perhaps is one of the few people that made Marxism palatable to Indians. And that is not a mean feat. So I think you all are unfair to Jagan, right? But you make that, I understand why you say that, because you want to say that the Indian narrative is smothered, right? There was an exchange, started in 1956 to 1964, between Guyana and Jagan. Guyana, who's articulating the African narrative of denial, and Jagan is articulating, and the two of them are jousting over that. So Jagan did articulate an Indian narrative. He did it within the context of Marxism, because that was the thing. Burnham talked about Marxism. Guyana was said to be a Simon Pugh Marxism, but that did not prevent them from engaging the ethnic question. And so there are narratives. If now the African narrative is articulated by African activists and intelligentsia in a louder way, it is because of where history has taken us. If that trajectory, as I said, changes tomorrow, the Indian narrative comes to the fore. And so therefore, we have to accept that there are going to be these narratives, and we have to look for the intersection. Now, don't expect me to articulate an Indian narrative in the circumstances. That does not mean that I do not acknowledge an Indian narrative as part of the African narrative. Power sharing, who are we sharing power with? God, the devil? We're sharing it with Indians and Amerindians, starting with Guyana long before, 4 years before Arthur Lewis. Guyana put forward a joint premiership, and that was the African narrative of intersection and inclusion. He was putting forward an African, a narrative of inclusion from the African perspective. And he's saying joint premiership with who? With a dog? With Indians. And so my generation continues to talk about power sharing, and Ravi, you've abandoned us. You were talking about it at one time. Power sharing with whom? With cats. Power sharing with Indians is an acknowledgement that Indians have standing, Indians have an equal place in Guyana. And insofar as power is a commodity that can move mountains, it must not be in the hands of one group. That it form part of the African narrative. So it's not just the African narrative of nationalism, Black nationalism. There's also the African narrative of inclusion. That is why Guyana's group was called the African Society for Racial Equality. So the African narrative has different dimensions, just as the Indian narrative has different dimensions. There's no single African narrative. There's the Black Marxist narrative. There's the Black nationalist narrative. There's the Black integration narrative. So there's not a single narrative. So we have to get this thing straight and don't fool ourselves, because we are making our jobs more difficult when we try by sleight of hand to say, well, when Heinz talks about power sharing, he's talking about African power. How can power sharing be about African power? Power sharing is about sharing with Indians and Amerindians and others. That does not mean that we will not talk about African nationalism. But there is African integration, African national integration, national inclusion, and we have narratives that reflect that.
So, Dr. Ramrak, we only got about 25 minutes left. If you could try to be parsimonious.
All right,
short
and
and
we
brief
need a
as
few
possible.
more shows to hash this out, and I think this is the reason why we need to have these kinds of discussion. But I'm going to pose a question here, right, and give a little bit of a little background, because this whole question of Indian narrative really is a concern to me. First to begin, if there is an Indian narrative, and we're saying that it exists in the literature and so on, and Vincent seems to be harking this back to what sounds like the old Keen Gibson, the notion of the caste system and in Hinduism and so on, but we can deal with that at another level. But the point is, how many people in Guyana are we, the four of us, aware of? Let's assume it exists in the literature, right? And again, it depends on which kind of literature you're talking about. Edgar Mittelholzer wrote about 23 novels. He was from Berbice. He lived among the Rohomans and wealthy Indians and so on. But in 8 of his novels, he portrayed Indians as very poor and backward, right? He felt they were being cheeky to be able to rise up to middle class status. So let me come back to this question now. Who in this environment that we're talking about could, and again, it's a rhetorical question, could Vincent and David point to who speak to the kind of language that we're speaking about to imply that we understand what that Indian narrative really means? I can't think of a single person in Guyana. Yeah, Ravi Dev is a loner in this, right?
And Betaram and Ms. Shaw and the moderator and Freddie Kissoon. There are many people who are articulating the Indian narrative. They may not articulate it in a way that you would like them to articulate it, but they are articulating it.
Okay, but let's go back to something that was said before. You keep going back to Chetty. Now Chetty, and I don't want to be critical of Chetty, but there's a whole body of literature, and if you read Clement Rohi's book, when they talk about Indian concern, these Indians were dubbed as if they were racist because they were concerned about Indians. Hari Prasad, the fellow who built Prasad Nagar, had meetings with people like Ganraj Kumar and all of those guys, the Magdums and so on, to talk about Indian concern. But every time those discussion comes up, these people, as Rohi described them, they were bringing up the Indian bogey. They were racist. So again, it comes back to who in this government, if this Indian, because the implication is that the PPP is guided by an Indian narrative and they're promoting an Indian agenda. And that comes out very clearly from those who criticize what they're doing. And I'll give an example, 2022, when Nigel did his presentation on, on who are getting the contracts and who these contractors are, he presented a narrative as if Indians are a privileged group without talking about, how those contracts may be allocated, without talking about the majority of Indians who live in rural area who are very poor. That conversation did not come up. So again, it comes back to, besides Ravi Dev and Vishnu Bishram and myself and Raihan Shah, who hasn't been in the public eye for quite a while, who exactly not just talk about an inner narrative, but daily on social media articulate that narrative to make it mean something. This is the advancement of the narrative that exists with David and others. You can talk about all kinds of things, even the whole issue of partition. That is how advanced your narrative is. When you talk about at the Emancipation Celebration, if an Indian narrative had existed, it would have counteracted two things you've said. One is the whole issue of balance of power, because I don't believe what some of you folks are saying about balance of power. I don't think you really believe that. I think you want the whole thing, because it comes back to this whole question of prior arrival and greater suffering, as I've written about. But the point is, if there was that Indian narrative, David, your language would have been tempered. I don't think you would have been using words like, slave catcher. I don't think Coretta McDonald would be negotiating with this government on behalf of the teachers, and then in the same, discussion, after her discussion, say this is an installed regime. That whole narrative does not, and it shows like there is really no respect for that Indian narrative. And if that exists, you, David, would recognize that there is an Indian narrative, so that when you talk about redistribution of distribution of the wealth equitably, in your discussion, you would also address the concern of the Indian narrative, which is to say, well, where is the concern about, balancing the armed force?
That's your job. That's your job.
Okay, but that's my point. But that's my point, that the Indian narrative is not there, and it's missing.
You are doing it. You are doing it.
So we are doing it, and there's two people who are doing it on the internet. It doesn't have any impact.
There's about 4 of us on the other side. You said that I am a fringe, but yet you and Ravi are implying here that I could make Black people act to liquidate Indians, that I'm not a fringe. Make up your mind.
Yes, because
I'm not fringe.
But you're adopting a narrative.
You all want to suck in and blow whistle at the same time. I am fringe, but I will make. I'm so powerful that my language will make Africans beat up Indians. That's what you are.
David,
yes,
David,
because
David, it only took 5 people to hang out in Buxton and create mayhem. You don't need a lot of people,
Then
David.
we are not fringe. Then
Only 5.
Then we are not fringe.
But the 5 people can create.
The 5
mayhem.
speak to the narrative that exists.
So let's hear Vincent because of time, huh?
Well, I didn't finish what I was trying to say, and I was going to address this whole question of
Go
this
ahead.
thing,
Take 2 minutes and finish up, Ramara.
I mean, this thing about, power sharing represents, as sort of a narrative for everyone. And that is something I would question, because I don't see that in the kind of power sharing that you're talking about, because it didn't exist. I mean, again, this is the whole story we've been talking about. To repeat what I've said before, it didn't exist in 2015. I mean, it exists in 2015 because you won the election because of that 11% or whatever percentage that Moses had talked about. But I didn't see any kind of sharing of power. The first thing that happened is, okay, you increase the power of wages of the ministers, and you're going to fire 7,000 sugar workers. If that government had recognized the narrative of the other side, you would have allowed the Indians in that government to speak to that narrative, and today you would have been in a much better position. Now, having said that, I'm not only blaming the coalition for destroying that narrative, and I think the responsibility also has to be, yes, on those two people, Moses Nagamutu and Kemraj Ramjatan. And this is why Indians will call them the Makaram, because they did not stand up to defend that narratives. So those are the examples I'm pulling out, and I'm saying, look, your narrative seems to be much greater, right? Because we don't have the number of people who have significant influence. The PPP government that you're talking about, these were the same people who staged a rally in front of Ravi Dev's house. This is the same set of people who call us racist because we're saying, look, you need to balance the force. You need to, to put back the word Indian in Indian Arrival Day. But these people see us as racist. So where is that Indian narrative in the hands of the people who have power and who are of significance and who can make significant changes? It's not there.
Okay, Vincent, you want to bring this to some understanding?
Vincent, you're muted.
Sorry, I don't think this issue could be discussed outside of the understanding of how the different ethnic groups are themselves structured. And in that regard, we have to look at the way in which the Indian group is structured. And, I have been told by PPP leaders that an Indian leader is a deity. And therefore, there's a certain response or non-response to Indian leaders. That is not the equivalent in the African Guyanese society. And so when one looks at a class position, where in our society, the economy is dominated by a certain set of people, and one looks at the disposition of Indians in terms of how they relate to each other, then one can see that that mass narrative you are asking for may well be suppressed by the deities who are accepted as the leaders of the Indians. And so there are issues within each of the groups that also have to be discussed in terms of how we approach the question and the emerging narratives. I don't think class could be dismissed, and that class plays a very, very important role, and that in the context of Guyana, our ethnic plurality, that when one speaks about domination, it is largely class domination, but that class domination is facilitated by the way in which the intra-Indian community relates, and therefore facilitates that to some extent, and it becomes a hindrance to the conversation which is in fact required. And I do accept that a conversation is required across the ethnic groups if we are in fact going to address the problem. I started off by saying the big issue we have is a non-acceptance of the problem. And I maintain that, and that's a big part of the problem we are faced with. And in fact, not only is there an acceptance, but there's a narrative about the problem not existing. And in that regard, I do not consider Roy to be a representative of the Indian narrative. Roy is very much other than a representing the Indian narrative.
No, he's not. I was just
But
picking examples from his book.
but leaving Rui aside, there isn't others who can be considered as representing the Indian narrative.
But the Indian narrative is not going to emerge in the manner in which you guys are calling for it to emerge. The Indian community genuflects to the class leadership of the country, which is largely Indian.
Ravi Dev?
Let me just start back so we can make some fundamental, some points. So
We only
can
got 10 minutes left, so just want to give
Yeah,
everybody
no,
one minute.
I'm going to be short. Because at this juncture, I think we need to take a deep breath. And I think there has been some progress, and we need to see how we can consolidate that progress, small as it may be. So my comment at this stage will be this, that those of us who have access to the public space, I think we have to be very careful with our words, especially, David, African Guyanese, and let's face it, their party is out of power, and they would be susceptible to exhortations of blaming others. So I do believe that within the present dispensation, I have spoken about a rational strategy going forward in terms of which it will be incorporated in a political narrative. You are now the leader of a political party. You are now a presidential candidate, right? And who knows how this may grow. You are also, I was very happy to hear that you are now a chief of an African chief. These are all important positions you now hold, which should give you pause in your public utterances, that in a plural society that has been fragmented for so long, grievances can be whipped up and you can have extreme action exploding into violence very clearly. I once wrote that after some speeches you made on the east coast of Demerara, after one individual had been killed by the police, and after you made it out to be a racially directed incident. And I pointed out that in Meadowbrook, an Indian individual had been killed by the police in identical circumstances, and that there was a cover-up. That it is not necessarily a racial incident, because the Indian one then was killed also. It might be more of an authoritarian response by a police force that was born out of authoritarianism. So all I would like to say at this juncture, with this new role that you are playing in terms of being a political party leader, and I was serious when I said that when you talk about being fringe or not, Mr. Koyana called them political sophisticates who tried to whip up sentiments among the Buxton Five. And they created mayhem in Guyana, not only for the surrounding Indian communities, but in Buxton itself. And I would not like to see us descend into such a maelstrom again for the sake of our future being. That's my say, Vishnu.
David, a minute?
I would like Ravi to direct some of those remarks, if not all of them, to the PPP government which he defends. I would like him to direct, because they have power, they have institutional power. All I have is the power of my advocacy. the PPP government has institutional power. Lecture them as you're lecturing me of how they should use power, and then come back to me. Don't talk to me about how I should modulate, and don't talk to them, because my fire is aimed not at you and Beto, at them. Institutional power. Tell them to be careful about what they do. Tell them to be careful about how they use institutional power, and then come back and lecture me. Don't lecture me, and don't lecture those who hold the keys of power in the society.
Ravidev, you want to rebut? 1 minute, quickly.
Not really. I think we're going to go back and forth here, because my point is that the PPP's riposte is exactly what is demanded in a democracy, whereby you try to woo people from across the divide. And I always come back to my own personal experience. I come from my village of Iflat, and I'm proud to say I was born and I grew up pretty much in the African section. And while I will not pretend to speak for African Guyanese, I would like to believe I have a tremendous amount of empathy, having my formative years in that section of my village. And I would like to say, for example, that the 50 poultry initiatives that were initiated in the African section of Iflat is going to have dividends. And I think that's the kind of action that we need. And if the coalition, when it was in power, had acted along those lines, I think it would have gone a long way in breaking down these barriers. I'm not
Beto, a minute.
No, I would just end by saying, look, rhetoric is important, right? And especially as we move towards 2025, I don't think the PPP will call an early election, but be that as it may, I think the situation exists, where I know it's going to be a competitive election, given the level of our plurality. And I think right now, the way it stands, if the rhetoric is tempered, one of the things we had said about 2015, which I think the coalition had adopted, which was we need to temper the rhetoric, eschew this whole notion of protest, because every time you protest, one set of people get beat up. And the third thing was coalition politics, which really worked on behalf of the coalition in 2015. And I think as we head into 2025, I think that's also important, because one factor which we don't consider is the fact that right now, plurality is important, because I do believe, and I know this information is not yet out in the public, which is that the census may show that the Indian population is about 35%. It's not 52% where it was in the year when Rodney was killed in 1980. So that demographics mean that if you're going to win elections, then in a system that gives us a plurality, it means that we have to be able to reach out to people on the other side. So this is why it is important, to have the narrative of all sides being heard, which I think we agree on here today, and secondly, it's also important for us to consider those narrative, and so that we can move on in 2025 or before or after, in terms of recognizing the importance of having a national narrative.
Vincent, a minute or two.
Well, as I've said to the inception, I think the beginning of solving the problem is the acceptance that the problem exists, and therefore there's a need for the problem itself to be articulated and to be accepted. In solving the problem, there's obviously going to be a need for the plurality to be taken into consideration. And I am of the strong view that, notwithstanding what 50 poultry farmers or whatever has occurred, that the present circumstance, the plurality is not being taken into consideration. There's a denial of the plurality. And in fact, there's every effort at domination, a domination which is facilitated by the realities of our society in many regards, both in terms of intra group relations and inter-group relations. So I would continue to say that we haven't today touched seriously on the question of governance and the way in which governance should be structured and mandated to respond to a plurality. And if we accept there's a plurality, then that's another issue that we've got to more seriously address.
And Dr. Ramrak said he expects a close election next year. You being on the commission, you see a close election next year?
I don't think that being on the commission allows me to see or not to see if there's going to be a close election. I wouldn't. I have different issues about the elections because you have all sorts of manipulations taking place in terms of how we register in boards, how we are registering people without identification of them with their particular place of residence. And so my concern with the elections are far removed from who wins or who loses. It's about the relevance of the election system to the problems our country is faced with. The relevance of that system to the plurality.
You want a minute to wrap up, David, or it's good to go?
Well, yeah, no, I've been having these discussions with Rafi going back more than a decade. And I think these discussions are useful. They're very useful. That when people can see 4 men, unfortunately 5 men, unfortunately, 3 of whom love their race and the other 2 love their race, and they can sit down and talk about the issue. I think we are making some progress, but we've got to get rid of the noise. They're mixing of concepts. So we are talking about elections. I think the issue that we are discussing here goes beyond elections. Elections don't solve problems of ethnic competition. In fact, elections tend to exacerbate them. And so that is why I get irritable when people bring in this whole notion of crossover and the PPP doing a good thing. PPP is politicking, as the PNC would and the WPA and others would.
It's all we got, boy. It's all we got.
We are talking about a more fundamental issue. And the fundamental issue we are talking about is how do we live together in a space that was meant for us not to live together.
I think that's a good way to end it.
But David, I'll leave this with you again, because we said we've talked more than 2 decades from that conversation in the Bottle Cafe in 1999. The thing is, though, that we are going to have elections next year, so we can't get around that. So all these tendencies and all these contradictions will rise to the fore. And all I'm saying, as a leader of a political party, as a presidential candidate, I would ask of you to lend your voice to produce outcomes that will not tear us apart again.
I do that every day.
Discussion to be continued, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us tonight. And I'm sure we'll have more of this in days